A lonely widow saved a stray dog, unaware it was a millionaire's lost companion. The thought never crossed Margaret Wilson's mind as she stood on her porch that rainy October evening, watching droplets cascade from the edge of her faded blue awning. The world beyond her small cottage had grown dim, both in the fading light of day and in her heart since Robert's passing 18 months ago. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around her thin frame, the wool scratchy against her wrists. She'd lost weight since Robert died. The neighbors had stopped bringing casseroles months ago, and cooking for one person seemed like more effort than it was worth most days. A flash of movement caught her eye, something darting between the oak trees that lined her property. Margaret squinted through the gray curtain of rain. There it was again. Small, quick, desperate. Before she realized what she was doing, Margaret had stepped off her porch into the downpour. The cold rain immediately soaked through her house slippers, but she pressed forward. "Hello?" she called, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. When was the last time she'd spoken aloud to anything besides her dead husband's photograph? A whimper answered her. Margaret followed the sound to the edge of her property where her flower garden, now overgrown with weeds, met the beginning of the woods. There, huddled beneath the skeletal remains of her once prized hydrangea bush, was a dog. Not just any dog. This creature was a sorry sight, matted fur plastered to its trembling body, one paw held gingerly above the ground. Its eyes, though, those eyes met Margaret's with an intelligence that made her breath catch. Deep brown pools, frightened yet somehow hopeful. "Oh, you poor thing," Margaret whispered, crouching down despite the protest of her arthritic knees. The dog cowered briefly, then inched forward, its wet nose quivering. "It's all right. I won't hurt you." Rain dripped from the end of Margaret's nose as she slowly extended her hand. For a moment the world narrowed to just this, an elderly woman and a trembling dog, both soaked to the skin, both alone in the world. Then the dog stretched forward and licked her fingers once, twice, a gesture of such pure trust that Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Something that had been frozen solid since the day they'd lowered Robert into the ground. "You need a name," Margaret said the next morning, watching the dog, now somewhat cleaner after a careful bath in her tub, explore her kitchen with cautious interest. The creature was some kind of terrier mix, she guessed, with wiry gray and white fur that had been revealed after she'd gently worked out the worst of the tangles. No collar, no identification. Just a badly sprained front paw that she'd wrapped as best she could with supplies from her ancient first aid kit. Margaret had called the local shelter last night, but felt a strange relief when no one answered at that late hour. "Just until your paw is better," she told both the dog and herself. "Then we'll find out where you belong." The dog looked at her with those intelligent eyes and thumped its tail against the linoleum floor. "How about Scout?" Margaret suggested, remembering Robert's favorite book. The dog's ears perked up. "Scout it is, then." "Temporary Scout?" she amended. But even as she said it, Margaret felt her lips form a shape they hadn't made in many long months. A smile. Later that afternoon, as Margaret gently redressed Scout's paw, the phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. Hardly anyone called except telemarketers these days, but on the fourth ring, she reached for the receiver. "Mrs. Wilson?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "This is Dr. Rivera from Oakdale Medical. I'm calling about your test results." Margaret's fingers went numb around the phone. The routine blood work from last week's checkup. She'd almost forgotten. "Mrs. Wilson? Are you there?" "Yes," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "I'm here. Your results show some concerning markers. I'd like you to come in tomorrow morning to discuss them in person." The world tilted slightly. Margaret felt Scout press against her leg, a warm, solid presence. "How concerning?" she managed to ask. "I'd rather not discuss specifics over the phone, but it's important we address this promptly. Can you come in at 9 tomorrow?" After hanging up, Margaret sat motionless at her kitchen table. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, illuminating dancing dust motes. Funny how the world looked exactly the same when everything had just changed. A soft weight settled in her lap. Scout had somehow maneuvered himself there despite his injured paw. He rested his head against her stomach and looked up at her. "Well," Margaret whispered, her fingers finding the soft spot behind his ears, "at least I'm not alone tonight." 3 towns away, in a mansion overlooking the lake, Alexander Harrington paced the length of his study for the 100th time that day. The sound of his Italian leather shoes against hardwood echoed in the cavernous room. 2 weeks, James. 2 weeks and not a single credible lead. Alexander ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, displeasure evident in the tight line of his mouth. James, his assistant of 15 years, stood patiently by the door. The reward has been increased as you requested, sir. It's now being circulated to all veterinary offices and shelters within a 100-mile radius. Alexander stopped at the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the manicured gardens below. They seemed emptier now, lacking the small figure that used to dart between the hedges. Edison was wearing his GPS collar. How does a dog just disappear? The question wasn't really directed at James, but at the universe that had taken the one living creature Alexander truly cared for. The storm that night was severe, sir. The electrical interference could have disabled the chip. And if someone found him and removed the collar... Alexander clenched his jaw. Edison had been more than a pet. After Alexandra's death 3 years ago, the little terrier had become his only family, the only living being who didn't want something from him besides companionship. Double the reward again, Alexander said, his voice like steel. And expand the search radius. I don't care what it costs. James nodded, making a note in his tablet. Of course, sir. Anything else? Alexander turned, his expression momentarily unguarded. For a flash, James saw what few ever did, not the ruthless business magnate worth hundreds of millions, but a lonely man mourning his last connection to happiness. Find him, James. Just find him. Margaret sat in Dr. Rivera's office, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The doctor's words washed over her in waves, some phrases cutting through with terrible clarity. Early stages. Treatment options. Support groups. Mrs. Wilson? Do you understand what I'm explaining to you? Margaret focused on the doctor's face. Kind, concerned, professionally detached. Cancer, she said, testing the word on her tongue. You're telling me I have cancer? Yes, but it's treatable. The prognosis for this particular type is quite good when caught early, which we have. Doctor? Rivera leaned forward. You'll need to start chemotherapy soon. I'd like to refer you to an oncologist colleague of mine. The most important thing now is that you have a support system in place. Is there someone who can help you through this? Family? Friends? Margaret almost laughed. Family? Her only son lived across the country with his wife and children. They called on holidays, sent obligatory birthday cards. Friends? Those had dwindled after Robert died, after she'd turned down too many invitations, stopped showing up at church. I have someone, she heard herself say. The image of Scout waiting at home, probably curled up on Robert's old armchair by now, filled her mind. Doctor, Rivera smiled. Good. You'll need them. Walking out of the medical center into the crisp autumn air, Margaret felt strangely detached from her body. Cancer. Such a small word for something so enormous. The maple trees lining the parking lot blazed in reds and oranges, more vibrantly alive than she felt. Her phone buzzed in her purse. Margaret checked it automatically, expecting another reminder about her prescriptions. Instead, she saw her son's name. Michael never called on weekdays. Mom? His voice sounded tinny and distant. We've been thinking about Christmas this year. Lisa's parents want us to come to Colorado, and with the kids' school schedule. Margaret stood in the middle of the parking lot as her son explained why, for the second year in a row, they wouldn't be visiting for the holidays. She should tell him about the diagnosis. She should interrupt and say, Michael, I have cancer. But something kept the words locked behind her teeth. That sounds lovely, dear, she said instead when he paused for her response. Colorado will be beautiful with snow. You're not disappointed? The relief in his voice was palpable. Of course not. You have your own family to think about. After she hung up, Margaret sat in her car for a long time, watching leaves spiral down from the trees. Tell people you have cancer, and suddenly you become a burden, an obligation. The thought of Michael uprooting his family out of duty, of pitying looks and hushed conversations when she left the room, made her stomach clench. This was her battle, hers and Scout's for whatever time they had together. The flyer caught Alexander's eye as he walked past the community bulletin board outside his regular coffee shop. He normally wouldn't have noticed. He wasn't the type to pay attention to lost cat announcements or lawn service advertisements, but a familiar word jumped out at him. Fall Festival and Pet Adoption Day. The flyer proclaimed in cheerful orange letters. All local shelters participating? This Saturday at Riverside Park. Alexander pulled out his phone and called James. Cancel my meetings on Saturday. All day. Sir? You have the investors' brunch and the— Cancel them, Alexander repeated. I'll be attending the town's pet adoption event. You're adopting another dog? James sounded bewildered. No, but every shelter within 50 miles will be there. If anyone has information about Edison, that's where I'll find it. 3 days later, Alexander walked through Riverside Park feeling distinctly out of place. His tailored coat and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the casual attire of families and volunteers milling about the booths and pens set up across the green space. For 2 hours, he methodically visited every shelter's station, showing Edison's picture, describing the distinctive white patch on his chest shaped like a bow tie. Most shelter workers were sympathetic but had no information. A few recognized him, or rather, recognized his face from the business magazines and news segments, and promised to keep an extra eye out. Alexander was about to admit defeat when he overheard a conversation at a refreshment stand. Never seen Margaret Wilson so animated in years, an elderly woman was saying to her companion. Ever since she found that little dog in her yard, it's like she's a different person. What kind of dog? Her friend asked. Some kind of scruffy terrier mix, gray and white. She's named him Scout, though I told her she should really take him to the shelter in case someone's looking for him. Alexander froze, his coffee halfway to his lips. Gray and white terrier. His heart began to pound. Excuse me, he interrupted, turning to the women. This woman with the dog, Margaret Wilson, where does she live? The women looked startled at his abrupt question. The first woman frowned suspiciously. Why do you want to know? Alexander pulled out his phone and showed them his background image, a picture of himself with Edison. I think she might have found my dog. He's been missing for almost 3 weeks now. The women exchanged glances. Well, said the first woman slowly, Margaret lives in the old Wilson cottage on Maple Road. Blue house with white trim, can't miss it. But I should warn you, Alexander was already walking away, phone to his ear. James, he said when his assistant answered, I need an address. The crisp autumn afternoon found Margaret sitting on her front porch swing, a blanket draped over her legs despite the mild temperature. Scout lay beside her, his head resting on her thigh. His paw had healed remarkably well in the 3 weeks since she'd found him, though he still favored it slightly when tired. Another beautiful day, Margaret murmured, scratching behind Scout's ears. The dog sighed contentedly in response. Her first chemotherapy session was scheduled for Monday. Dr. Kim, the oncologist, had been kind but frank about the side effects she might experience. The pamphlets sat on her kitchen counter, filled with clinical descriptions of nausea, fatigue, and hair loss. Margaret had read them once, then tucked them under her cookbook. We'll manage, won't we? She asked Scout. In response, he licked her hand, his warm tongue gentle against her papery skin. The sound of tires on gravel drew her attention. A sleek black car was pulling into her driveway, the kind of luxury vehicle that never appeared in this modest neighborhood. Margaret watched, curiosity overriding her initial alarm, as the car stopped and a man emerged from the driver's side. Tall, distinguished-looking, with the kind of bearing that suggested authority and wealth. His clothing, casual by some standards but clearly expensive, reinforced the impression. What on earth would someone like him want here? Then Scout's head shot up. His entire body went rigid, ears pointed forward. A high-pitched whine escaped him. Scout? Margaret questioned, suddenly uneasy. The dog exploded into motion, leaping from the swing and bounding down the porch steps with a speed that belied his recent injury. He raced across the yard, barking joyfully. The stranger stopped dead in his tracks. Edison? He called, his voice breaking on the name. The dog, Scout, Edison, whoever he was, reached the man and began jumping up, pawing at his legs, making sounds Margaret had never heard him make before, half bark, half desperate cry. The man dropped to his knees right there on her front walkway, heedless of his expensive trousers. He gathered the dog into his arms, burying his face in the gray and white fur. Edison. He kept saying, Edison. Margaret stood slowly, her hand gripping the porch railing for support. Something cold and heavy settled in her stomach as she watched the reunion playing out before her. She should have known, should have tried harder to find his owner, should have prepared herself for this moment. The man finally looked up, noticing her for the first time. He rose to his feet, the dog, Edison, cradled in his arms like something precious. As he approached the porch, Margaret could see his eyes were damp. Ms. Wilson? He asked. Mrs. She corrected automatically. Margaret Wilson. Alexander Harrington. He shifted the dog to one arm and extended his hand. "I believe you've been taking care of my dog." Margaret shook his hand briefly, noting the firm grip, the manicured nails. "I found him during the big storm last month. He was injured. I called the shelter, but—" Her voice trailed off. The excuses sounded hollow now. "Thank you," Alexander said simply. "I've been searching everywhere for him. He disappeared during that same storm, must have been frightened by the thunder and bolted through a gate left open by the landscapers." He stroked the dog's head. "He's my—" He seemed to struggle for the right word. "He's very important to me." Margaret nodded, feeling numb. Of course, Scout Edison had an owner, a home, a life before her. She'd always known this day might come, had told herself repeatedly that their arrangement was temporary, so why did it feel like her heart was being torn from her chest? "Would you like to come in?" she offered, the years of ingrained politeness guiding her when emotion failed. "I have his things inside. His bed, some toys I found for him." Alexander hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. That would be helpful." Inside her modest living room, Margaret was suddenly aware of the shabby furniture, the dusty photographs, the general air of a life put on pause. Alexander Harrington looked comically out of place standing there with his perfect posture and air of quiet wealth. Edison, she must think of him as Edison now, squirmed in Alexander's arms until he was set down. The dog immediately trotted over to Margaret and pressed against her legs, looking up with those soulful eyes that had kept her company through so many difficult nights. "He's clearly attached to you," Alexander observed. "He's usually wary of strangers. We've been good company for each other," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. She moved to the corner where she'd set up Scout's, Edison's, bed and collected the few dog toys she'd purchased, placing them in a paper bag. "He likes the squeaky squirrel best." Alexander watched her, his expression unreadable. "How did you find him exactly?" Margaret told him about that rainy night, about the injured paw, about her decision to care for him until he healed. She didn't mention the doctor's appointment the next day or the diagnosis that followed. Didn't explain how the little dog had given her a reason to get up each morning, despite the fear that threatened to paralyze her. "He was wearing a collar when I lost him," Alexander said. "With ID tags and a GPS tracker?" Margaret shook her head. "There was no collar when I found him. It must have come off somehow." A silence fell between them, punctuated only by the ticking of the old mantel clock. Edison moved restlessly between them, sensing the tension. "Well," Margaret finally said, picking up the paper bag, "here are his things. He's healing nicely, but you might want to have your vet check his paw." Alexander accepted the bag. Mrs. Wilson, I can't thank you enough for taking care of him. Please, let me compensate you for your expenses and trouble." He reached for his wallet, but Margaret raised a hand to stop him. "No, that's not necessary." The thought of being paid for what had been the most meaningful weeks of her recent life was unbearable. "I insist. Edison is—" Alexander paused, looking down at the dog. "After my wife died, he's been my only family. I don't know what I would have done if—" "Please," Margaret interrupted, her composure finally cracking. "Just take him and go." Alexander studied her face, noticing for the first time the deep fatigue in her eyes, the slight tremble in her hands. He nodded slowly. "Of course. Thank you again." At the door, Edison balked, looking back at Margaret with confusion. Alexander had to gently tug the leash he'd brought. "Come on, boy. Time to go home." Margaret stood in her doorway, watching as Alexander led Edison to the car. The dog kept looking back, his steps reluctant. Alexander opened the back door, and Edison finally jumped in, settling on what appeared to be a custom dog seat. As the black car disappeared down her driveway, Margaret closed her door and leaned against it. The house seemed impossibly silent, empty in a way it hadn't been since Robert died. She slid down until she was sitting on the floor, her back against the door, and finally allowed the tears to come. Alexander couldn't sleep. Edison was back, safe and sound, curled up in his special bed in the corner of Alexander's bedroom. Everything should have been perfect. Yet Alexander found himself staring at the ceiling, replaying the afternoon's events. The look on Margaret Wilson's face as they left haunted him. There had been something there beyond simple attachment to a temporary pet. Something that reminded him of himself 3 years ago, when Alexandra's hospital room had emptied for the last time. He rolled over, punching his pillow into a more comfortable shape. What did he know about Margaret Wilson? Elderly widow, modest means, living alone in a house filled with photographs and memories. And she had nursed Edison back to health, given him a temporary name, made him toys. She had needed him, perhaps as much as Alexander did. The next morning, Alexander made a rare appearance in his company's research department. "I need everything you can find on Margaret Wilson of Maple Road," he told his surprised head of security. "Property records, public information, medical history if you can access it legally." "Sir?" The security chief looked bewildered. "Is this a business matter?" "It's personal," Alexander replied, "and confidential." 2 days later, a folder appeared on Alexander's desk. He waited until the evening to open it after most of his staff had gone home. Edison lay at his feet as he flipped through the sparse collection of facts that constituted Margaret Wilson's life. 72 years old, widow of Robert Wilson, deceased 18 months prior, one son living in California, limited income from her late husband's pension and Social Security. And then, the most recent entry, diagnostic code for breast cancer, dated just 3 weeks ago. First chemotherapy appointment scheduled for yesterday. Alexander closed the folder, feeling like an intruder. But more than that, feeling a strange kinship with the woman. He knew what it was to face life's darkest moments alone. Edison raised his head, as if sensing his master's disquiet. Alexander scratched behind the dog's ears absently. "What do you think, boy? Did you take good care of Mrs. Wilson?" The dog's tail thumped against the carpet. Alexander made his decision before he fully realized it. "James," he called, knowing his assistant would still be at his desk despite the late hour. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow afternoon." Margaret sat in her garden, bundled against the autumn chill despite the sunshine. Yesterday's chemotherapy session had left her feeling drained and slightly nauseated, though not as badly as she had feared. The oncology nurse had told her the real fatigue often hit a day or two later. She'd splurged on a bird feeder the week before, and now she watched as chickadees and finches darted back and forth. Their constant movement and cheerful chirping provided a welcome distraction from the quiet house. The garden itself needed attention. Weeds had overtaken many of the beds since Robert's passing. He had been the one with the green thumb, coaxing roses and daylilies from the soil while she admired his handiwork. Perhaps in the spring she would try to restore some of it, if the treatments went well, if she had the energy, if... The now familiar sound of tires on gravel drew her attention. The same black car from 3 days ago was pulling into her driveway. Margaret's heart leaped traitorously as she spotted a gray and white head in the passenger window. Alexander Harrington emerged from the driver's side, and Edison, she still thought of him as Scout half the time, bounded out after him. The dog spotted her immediately and raced across the lawn, his entire body wiggling with excitement. Margaret couldn't help herself. She bent down as he reached her, allowing him to cover her face with enthusiastic licks as she ran her hands over his soft fur. "Hello, sweet boy," she murmured. "Hello?" When she looked up, Alexander was standing a respectful distance away, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Mr. Harrington," she acknowledged, straightening with some effort. "This is unexpected." "Mrs. Wilson." He nodded. "Edison has been unsettled since we left. I thought perhaps a visit might help him adjust." Margaret glanced down at the dog, who had pressed himself against her legs, tail wagging furiously. "I see. May we join you?" Alexander gestured to the garden bench beside her chair. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. As Alexander sat down, she noticed he carried a wicker basket. "I brought lunch," he explained, seeing her curious look. "I thought you might enjoy some company." The presumption should have irritated her. Instead, Margaret found herself touched by the gesture. "That's very kind of you." Alexander opened the basket, revealing an assortment of gourmet sandwiches, fresh fruit, and what appeared to be homemade cookies. "I wasn't sure what you might like," he said, suddenly seeming less sure of himself. "It all looks wonderful," Margaret assured him. And it did, though her appetite had been poor since yesterday's treatment. They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence, Edison moving between them, accepting the occasional morsel from both. The autumn sun warmed Margaret's face, and for a little while, she almost forgot about the chemical cocktail currently working its way through her system. "How are you feeling after your treatment?" Alexander asked quietly. Margaret's sandwich stopped halfway to her mouth. "How did you—" "I made inquiries," Alexander admitted. "I hope you don't mind. When I saw you the other day, I sensed something was wrong beyond just Edison." Margaret should have been angry at the invasion of privacy. Instead, she felt a strange relief. Someone knew. Someone had asked. "I'm managing," she said simply. Alexander nodded, not pushing for details. "My wife had breast cancer," he said after a moment. 3 years ago. She didn't survive." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, created an immediate bridge between them. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, meaning it. She loved gardens. Alexander continued, looking around at Margaret's overgrown beds. "We had a greenhouse built so she could have flowers year-round. Robert was the gardener in our family," Margaret offered. "I never had the touch." They fell silent again, but the quality of it had changed. There was understanding now, a recognition of shared experience. "Why did you really come today, Mr. Harrington?" Margaret finally asked. Alexander looked at her directly. "Alexander, please. And I came because Edison missed you. Because you took care of him when he needed it most." He paused. "And because I wondered if perhaps you might need someone to take care of you. Just a little, while you go through this." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I'm a stranger to you. Not to Edison." Alexander's smile was slight but genuine. "And he's an excellent judge of character." As if on cue, the dog rested his head on Margaret's knee, looking up at her with those soulful eyes. "What exactly are you proposing?" Margaret asked cautiously. "Friendship," Alexander said simply. "Company during a difficult time. Edison and I could visit regularly, perhaps help around the house or garden." Margaret's pride bristled. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity to accept help when you're unwell," Alexander countered gently. "And Edison would be getting something he clearly needs as well." Margaret looked at the dog, then at Alexander. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. "Perhaps a trial arrangement," she conceded. "For Edison's sake." Alexander's smile deepened. "For Edison's sake." The weeks that followed established a routine none of them could have anticipated. 3 days a week, Alexander would arrive with Edison. While Margaret rested, Alexander tackled projects around her house, fixing the leaky kitchen faucet, replacing burnt-out light bulbs, clearing dead leaves from the gutters. Edison divided his time between them, often curling up beside Margaret during her frequent naps, his warm presence anchoring her when the fatigue and nausea threatened to sweep her away. Alexander never stayed overnight, maintaining a respectful distance that Margaret appreciated, but he arranged for grocery deliveries and occasionally brought homemade meals prepared by his chef, who, he explained, was delighted to have someone new to cook for. Margaret learned that Alexander had built his technology company from scratch, selling it for millions but staying on as CEO. That his late wife, Alexandra, had been an accomplished botanist. That despite his wealth, he lived relatively simply, finding most social events tedious and preferring quiet evenings at home with Edison and a good book. In turn, Margaret shared stories of her teaching career, of raising her son, of the 43 years she'd spent with Robert. Photographs came down from dusty shelves, memories unearthed and examined in the gentle light of new friendship. After particularly difficult treatment days, when Margaret could barely lift her head from the pillow, Alexander would simply sit in her living room, working quietly on his laptop, while Edison maintained his self-appointed position as her guardian. "You don't have to stay," she told him once, embarrassed by her weakness. "I know," he replied, not looking up from his computer. "But Edison would worry if we left." It became their gentle fiction that these visits were primarily for the dog's benefit. It allowed Margaret to accept help without feeling like a burden, and it gave Alexander permission to care for someone again without confronting his own loneliness too directly. The oncologist was pleased with Margaret's progress. "Your blood counts are better than expected, doctor," Kim told her during a checkup in late November. "And you're maintaining your weight, which is excellent. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What she was doing, Margaret realized, was living again. Not just existing, not just going through the motions, but actively participating in life, planning for days beyond the immediate future, finding joy in small moments. Edison's excited greeting, Alexander's dry humor, the first snowfall viewed from her window with a cup of tea in hand. One crisp December afternoon, Margaret emerged from a nap to find Alexander in her garden, methodically preparing the beds for winter. Edison supervised from a sunny patch nearby. "You don't have to do that," Margaret called from the porch, wrapped in her warmest sweater. Alexander looked up, squinting against the low winter sun. "I know, but I thought perhaps in the spring you might want to plant something new." He straightened, brushing soil from his hands that probably hadn't done manual labor in years before meeting her. Alexandra always said gardens are about hope, about believing in another season. Margaret felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "I'd like that." Later, as they sat in her kitchen sharing soup and fresh bread Alexander had brought, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I have a proposal to make." Margaret raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. Not at all. It's just, Christmas is coming up. Your son and his family will be in Colorado, you mentioned. Alexander paused. I usually spend the holiday alone. Edison gets a special dinner and extra treats, and we ignore the whole affair otherwise. Sounds familiar, Margaret admitted. I thought perhaps we might ignore it together this year. Here, if you're comfortable with that. Or at my home, if you'd prefer a change of scenery. Margaret studied him. In the weeks she'd known him, Alexander had never invited her to his home. This felt like a crossing of some invisible boundary they'd established. Why? She asked simply. Alexander met her gaze steadily. Because I've come to value your company, Margaret. And because no one should be alone on Christmas if they don't wish to be. Margaret thought about it, about spending the holiday in her quiet house with only photographs and memories versus sharing it with Alexander and Edison. The choice wasn't really difficult at all. I think I'd like to see this greenhouse you've mentioned, she said. Alexander's smile made him look years younger. Edison will be delighted. Christmas Eve found Margaret standing in the center of Alexandra Harrington's greenhouse, surrounded by blooms that had no business flowering in December. The space was magical, glass walls and ceiling revealing the star-filled night sky, the interior warm and humid, filled with the sweet perfume of flowers and rich earth. It's beautiful, she breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. Edison trotted beside her, occasionally nosing at a plant or looking up to ensure she was still delighted. Alexander watched from near the entrance, his expression soft. She would have liked sharing it with you, he said quietly. Alexandra wasn't possessive about beautiful things. She believed they should be experienced by as many people as possible. Margaret touched a delicate orchid bloom with gentle fingers. She sounds remarkable. Alexander moved further into the greenhouse. Different from you in many ways, but similar in the ones that matter most. Margaret looked at him curiously. And what ways are those? Kindness. Strength. The ability to find joy in simple things. Alexander stopped beside her. The capacity to heal others just by being present in their lives. Margaret felt her cheeks warm, and not from the greenhouse's heat. You give me too much credit. I don't think I give you enough. Alexander's voice was soft but certain. My life has been fuller since meeting you, Margaret. Happier. The admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. Margaret found herself without words, touched beyond measure by the simple truth of it. Because her life, too, had expanded since that rainy night when a bedraggled dog had taken shelter in her garden. I brought you out here for a reason, Alexander continued after a moment. He gestured to a small potting bench in the corner, where a wrapped package waited. Happy Christmas, Margaret. She accepted the gift with slightly trembling hands. I have something for you as well, but it's nothing compared to all this. She waved her hand to encompass the greenhouse, the luxurious guest room where she was staying, the general opulence of his home. I doubt that very much, Alexander said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Open it. Margaret carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a leather-bound book. Opening it, she gasped softly. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, of Edison. Edison curled up asleep on her lap. Edison playing in her yard. Edison watching attentively as she read. Interspersed were candid shots of Margaret herself, often unaware of the camera, smiling, laughing, looking more alive than she had in years. How did you... I've been taking them over these past weeks, Alexander explained. I wanted you to see what Edison and I see when we look at you. What they saw clearly was not a sick woman, not a cancer patient, not a burden. They saw Margaret, vital, important, beloved. Thank you, she whispered, blinking back tears. This is perfect. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small, plainly wrapped package. This will seem very humble in comparison. Alexander unwrapped it carefully to reveal a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. You made this? Margaret nodded. During those long afternoons when you thought I was napping. I used to knit for Robert every Christmas. It's been years since I've made anything, but... She shrugged self-consciously. Alexander wrapped the scarf around his neck immediately, his expression one of genuine pleasure. No one has made me anything by hand since I was a child. This is... Thank you, Margaret. Edison, sensing the emotional moment, pressed against both their legs, creating a triangle of connection in the peaceful greenhouse. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the glass ceiling with delicate flakes that glittered in the soft lighting. Margaret watched it, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over her. Whatever tomorrow brought, more treatments, more challenges, more uncertainty, tonight she was here, with two souls who had unexpectedly become essential to her happiness. Merry Christmas, Alexander. she said softly. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," he answered, his voice warm with affection. And Edison, the catalyst for it all, wagged his tail in perfect contentment. Spring arrived with a gentle persistence, coaxing buds from bare branches and turning Margaret's garden into a canvas of possibility. Her final chemotherapy treatment was behind her, and though fatigue still dogged her steps some days, her prognosis was excellent. "Complete response to treatment, Doctor," Kim had announced during her last visit, her smile wide and genuine. "We'll continue monitoring, of course, but all signs point to remission." Remission. The word had echoed in Margaret's mind as Alexander drove her home that day, Edison's head resting on her shoulder from the back seat. "This calls for celebration," Alexander had declared, his relief as palpable as her own. Now, 6 weeks later, Margaret knelt in her garden, carefully planting seedlings Alexander had brought from his greenhouse. Edison supervised from a sunny patch nearby, occasionally wandering over to inspect her progress before returning to his important work of sunbathing. So much had changed in the 6 months since that rainy night when a lost dog had sought shelter beneath her hydrangea bush. Her relationship with Alexander had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, a deep friendship tinged with something that might, in time, become more. They moved slowly, respectful of their past loves and losses, content to let their connection deepen naturally. Alexander still maintained his own home, but spent more evenings at Margaret's cottage than not. Edison had his own bed in both houses, but often chose to sleep near Margaret, as if still keeping watch over her health. "Those look happy," Alexander observed, joining her in the garden with 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed one to Margaret as she accepted his help to stand, her knees protesting the prolonged contact with the earth. "They should be," Margaret said, brushing soil from her gardening gloves. "They've been thoroughly spoiled in your greenhouse." Alexander smiled, watching as Edison trotted over to greet him. "Some living things thrive best with a little extra care." Margaret knew he wasn't just talking about plants. "And some caregivers need care themselves," she countered softly. Alexander's eyes met hers, warm with understanding. They had healed each other these past months. His grief for Alexandra, her loneliness after Robert, the cancer that had threatened to define her remaining years, all had been transformed through their unexpected connection. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, glancing around the garden. "This place has wonderful bones, but it needs some structural work. The irrigation system is outdated, and that back fence won't make it through another winter." Margaret sipped her lemonade, hiding a smile. This was Alexander's way, identifying problems he could fix, offering help without making her feel helpless. "Is that so?" And that guest room you've set up for me is charming, but the mattress leaves something to be desired." Now Margaret did smile. "Are you angling for an invitation to redecorate, Mr. Harrington?" Alexander's expression grew more serious. "I'm suggesting that perhaps Edison would be happier if his 2 favorite people weren't living in separate houses." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Alexander, not marriage, not yet," he clarified quickly. "Just sharing our lives more fully, making this arrangement we've stumbled into more permanent." He gestured between them. "This works, Margaret. You, me, Edison. We make sense together." Margaret looked around her garden, at the cottage that had felt so empty after Robert died, at Edison watching them with those intelligent eyes, at Alexander standing before her with such honest hope in his expression. "Yes," she said simply. "We do make sense." Alexander's smile was like sunrise. "Edison will be delighted." "Only Edison?" Margaret teased, setting down her lemonade glass. "Well, his happiness is paramount, of course," Alexander replied, his eyes crinkling. "But I admit I have a personal interest as well." Margaret stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on his chest. "And what interest is that?" "Life is unexpected, Margaret Wilson," Alexander said softly. "I came looking for a lost dog and found everything I didn't know I was missing." As their lips met in a gentle kiss, Edison barked once, approving, before returning to his sunbeam. Around them, the garden bloomed with new life, a testament to second chances and the healing power of unexpected connections. A lonely widow had saved a stray dog, unaware it was a millionaire's lost companion. But in truth, they had saved each other, dog, widow, and millionaire alike, creating a family where none had existed before, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in life's most unexpected moments.